My stepbrother kept hiding my epilepsy medication as a prank until the hospital asked why I had so many seizures. The first time I woke up on the kitchen floor with my dad screaming and Ethan standing in the doorway filming on his phone, I thought I'd just passed out from dehydration after basketball practice. Dad called 911 while I lay there confused and tasting blood in my mouth where I'd bitten through my tongue. The paramedics arrived asking questions I couldn't answer because I had no memory of falling or losing consciousness. They loaded me into an ambulance and Dad rode with me while Ethan stayed home with my stepmom, Carol. At the hospital, a neurologist named Dr. Vincent ran tests and showed me brain scans revealing abnormal electrical activity. He diagnosed me with epilepsy, explaining that my first seizure had likely been triggered by dehydration and physical exhaustion. He prescribed medication called Keppra that I'd need to take twice daily, morning and night, never missing doses. Missing even one dose could lower my seizure threshold and put me at risk for another episode. He made me repeat the instructions back to confirm I understood how critical consistency was for keeping the seizures controlled. I started taking the medication religiously, setting phone alarms for 7 in the morning and 7 at night. The pills came in an orange bottle that I kept on my bathroom counter next to my deodorant, so I'd see it every day when I got ready. For the first 3 weeks, everything went smoothly. The medication made me slightly tired at first, but Dr. Vincent said that side effect would fade as my body adjusted. I felt stable and protected knowing the seizures were under control. Then one morning, I woke to my alarm, stumbled into the bathroom, still half asleep, and found the medication bottle missing from the counter. I checked the cabinet, the drawers, even looked in the shower, thinking maybe I'd moved it while groggy the night before. Nothing. I went downstairs and asked Dad if he'd seen it while cleaning, and he looked confused, saying he never touched my medications. Carol was already at work, and Ethan was still asleep, so I searched the entire bathroom again before finally finding the bottle wedged behind the toilet tank in a space so tight I almost missed it. It seemed weird, but not impossible that I'd placed it there myself while exhausted. The second time it happened 4 days later, the bottle was in the linen closet buried under washcloths. I started feeling uneasy because I knew with certainty I hadn't put it there, but I told myself I was being paranoid or maybe having medication side effects affecting my memory. The third time, the bottle was in my bedroom closet inside my old gym bag. That's when the pattern became undeniable. Someone was deliberately moving my medication, and the only person with access to my bathroom besides me was Ethan, whose room shared the connecting bathroom between our spaces. We'd been stepbrothers for 18 months since Dad married Carol, and Ethan had always been the type to push boundaries with what he called pranks. He'd hide my car keys before school, delete my Xbox game saves, put hot sauce in my water bottle, all while claiming it was just harmless fun. Dad and Carol always defended him, saying he was just trying to bond with me, and I needed to stop being so serious. But hiding medication that prevented seizures crossed a line from annoying to genuinely dangerous. I confronted Ethan after finding my pills in the gym bag, catching him in the hallway before school. He was 16, a year younger than me, with this smug expression he always wore when he knew he'd gotten away with something. I asked him straight out if he'd been moving my medication, and he laughed, actually laughed out loud, before saying he thought it was hilarious watching me panic every morning looking for it. He said I was too uptight about everything and needed to learn to take a joke. I told him the medication wasn't something to mess with and missing doses could trigger seizures, but he rolled his eyes and said I was being dramatic, like I always was about everything. He walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there feeling furious and powerless. I went to Dad that evening and explained what was happening, showing him the pattern of where I'd found the pills. He listened with concern, but then suggested maybe I was misplacing the bottles myself due to stress or medication effects. When I insisted Ethan had admitted to moving them, he said he'd talk to him, but asked me to be understanding because Ethan was still adjusting to having a stepbrother. The conversation with Ethan apparently consisted of Dad asking him to be more considerate, because the next morning my medication was in the kitchen pantry behind cereal boxes. I found it while looking for breakfast, the bottle hidden so well I only spotted it because light reflected off the orange plastic. Ethan sat at the table eating toast and watching me with barely contained amusement. I took my dose right there, and then bought a small lockbox from the hardware store, putting my medication inside with a combination lock only I knew. Problem solved, I thought. But 3 days later I came home from practice to find the lockbox missing entirely. I searched my room before checking Ethan's space, where I found it on his desk completely empty. The medication was gone. He'd somehow figured out the combination or broken the lock and taken every single pill. I had maybe 10 hours before I'd be dangerously overdue on my evening dose. I drove to the pharmacy and explained the situation to the pharmacist, asking for an emergency refill. She checked my insurance and said they wouldn't cover another refill for 3 weeks because I'd just filled the prescription 12 days ago. I explained that my medication had been stolen and I needed it for seizure control, but she said insurance companies didn't make exceptions based on circumstances, only on preventing medication abuse and diversion. The medication cost $380 out of pocket, money I absolutely didn't have as a high school senior saving for college while working part-time at a sporting goods store. I called Dr. Vincent's office and his nurse said they could provide samples, but I'd need to come to the office during business hours, and I was already at school missing practice. The nurse suggested I try urgent care and explain the situation, that they might prescribe a small bridge supply. I spent 2 hours at urgent care explaining to a skeptical doctor that my stepbrother had stolen my seizure medication as a prank. The doctor looked at me like I was drug-seeking and only agreed to prescribe 5 days of pills after I showed him Dr. Vincent's diagnosis paperwork and my empty prescription bottle that Ethan had eventually returned. That evening, I confronted Ethan again, this time with Dad and Carol present. I explained that he'd stolen my medication and forced me to spend hours getting an emergency prescription, missing practice and spending money I needed for college. Ethan denied everything, saying I must have lost the pills myself and was blaming him to avoid taking responsibility for my own carelessness. Dad looked uncertain, clearly torn between believing me and believing his new stepson. Carol defended Ethan immediately, saying her son would never do something so dangerous and I needed to stop making false accusations. She suggested maybe I was having memory problems from the epilepsy and should see my doctor about medication adjustments. The conversation ended with me being told to keep better track of my prescriptions and Ethan being completely excused from any consequences. I went to my room and punched the wall from frustration and fear because I was living with someone who was actively sabotaging my medical treatment and the adults in charge refused to acknowledge it. I started keeping my medication in my car, locked in the center console where Ethan couldn't access it. For 6 days, everything was fine. Then one morning I went to my car and found the console forced open and the medication gone. Ethan didn't have a key to my car, which meant he'd broken in somehow. I found pry marks around the driver's door lock and the interior panel partially removed. He'd gone to serious effort to steal my pills, escalating from pranks to property damage and theft. I showed Dad the damage and the missing medication, and he finally seemed to take it seriously. He confronted Ethan, who admitted he'd taken the pills, but insisted he was just trying to teach me not to be so paranoid about everything. He said if I'd just relaxed and stopped making such a big deal about the medication, he would have stopped messing with it. Dad grounded him for 2 weeks and made him pay for the car lock repair, but the punishment felt completely inadequate for what he'd done. Carol argued that I'd provoked Ethan by repeatedly accusing him and that teenage boys make mistakes and shouldn't be treated like criminals. 4 days into Ethan's grounding, I had my second seizure. It happened at school during chemistry lab, 39 hours after my last dose of medication. One moment I was measuring compounds, and the next, I was on the floor convulsing while my teacher screamed for help. I came to in an ambulance with a paramedic asking me questions I couldn't process through the fog in my brain. The hospital kept me overnight for observation, and Dr. Vincent came to see me the next morning, his expression grim. He asked if I'd been taking my medication consistently, and I broke down, explaining everything about Ethan and the hidden pills and the stolen bottles and the broken car lock. He documented everything in his notes and said he was required to report this to Child Protective Services because I was a minor being denied access to necessary medication by another household member. He explained that medication interference could be considered medical neglect or abuse, depending on the circumstances and intent. Before he left, he gave me 6 weeks' worth of samples and told me to keep them somewhere absolutely secure, suggesting I talk to the school nurse about storing them in the health office during the day. The CPS investigation consisted of a caseworker named Dennis visiting our house and interviewing each family member separately. He spoke to me first, asking about the medication incidents and the seizures. I showed him my documentation, the dates I'd found pills missing, the urgent care visit records, the car repair invoice, photos of the pry marks. He took detailed notes and said he'd talk to the others. His conversation with Ethan lasted maybe 20 minutes, and afterward he told Dad that while the situation was troubling, Ethan was a minor himself and seemed genuinely remorseful about his actions. He said blended families often had adjustment issues and recommended family counseling. No charges, no separation, no real consequences, just a recommendation that we all learn to communicate better. Dennis's report concluded that while Ethan's behavior was inappropriate and concerning, it appeared to be adolescent boundary testing rather than malicious intent to harm. The case was closed within 10 days. Family counseling with a therapist named Lawrence started the following month. The first session involved each of us describing our perspective on the family dynamics. Ethan performed brilliantly, talking about how difficult it had been to adjust to having a new stepbrother and how he sometimes acted out for attention because he felt displaced in his own home. He apologized to me in front of Lawrence and Dad and Carol, saying he understood now that his pranks had been hurtful and dangerous and he wanted to do better. Dad teared up with relief. Carol looked vindicated. Lawrence praised Ethan for his emotional intelligence and accountability. I sat there knowing the apology was complete bullshit, watching my family buy into his performance. Lawrence assigned us homework to do activities together to build trust and repair our relationship. The session ended with everyone except me feeling optimistic about our family healing and moving forward. 5 days after that first counseling session, I woke up at 2 in the morning to use the bathroom. Ethan was in there, standing at the counter with my medication bottle in his hand. He was dumping pills into the toilet, and when he saw me, he smiled and said he was helping me by making sure I didn't take too much and overdose. The lie was so blatant I didn't even bother arguing. I tried to grab the bottle, but he flushed the toilet first, sending at least a week's worth of pills down the drain. He handed me the half-empty bottle and walked back to his room, while I stood there shaking with rage. I locked my bedroom door and slept with the remaining pills under my pillow, knowing I couldn't tell Dad because he wouldn't believe me and would probably say I'd dropped them in the toilet myself. The next day, I started documenting everything. I bought a small camera that looked like a phone charger and set it up in the bathroom, pointing at the counter where I kept my medication. I kept a detailed log of every dose, noting the exact time, the number of pills remaining in the bottle, and where I stored them. I took photos of the bottle's position before bed and again in the morning. I was building evidence because I knew Ethan would escalate again, and I needed proof that would be impossible to dismiss. 3 days passed with no incidents, and I started to wonder if maybe the toilet incident had scared him into stopping. Then, on the 4th day, the camera captured him entering the bathroom at 6 in the morning, exactly 1 hour before my alarm. The footage showed him opening my medication bottle, removing 4 pills, and replacing them with what looked like identical pills from his pocket. He'd apparently found pills that matched the size and color of my Keppra, and was substituting them. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I took the suspicious pills and had them tested at a lab that did drug identification. The results came back 3 days later, confirming they were caffeine pills, completely inert for seizure control. Ethan had been secretly replacing my actual medication with fake pills for who knows how long, meaning I'd been taking ineffective doses while thinking I was protected. The deliberate nature of this escalation was terrifying. This wasn't impulsive pranking anymore. This was premeditated sabotage that required planning and effort. He'd researched what my pills looked like, purchased matching placebos, and systematically replaced doses to ensure I'd have more seizures. I took the lab results and the camera footage to Dad that evening and demanded he watch the video. He sat there in silence as the footage played, showing Ethan clearly and deliberately tampering with my medication. When it finished, Dad looked sick and angry in a way I'd never seen before. Dad confronted Ethan with Carol present, showing them both the footage and the lab results. Ethan's face went pale, and he started stammering excuses, claiming he was just trying to help me by reducing my medication dependence because he'd read online that epilepsy drugs were dangerous and addictive. Carol immediately defended him, saying he was genuinely concerned about my health and made a mistake out of love. Dad cut her off and said this wasn't a mistake. This was systematic interference with medical treatment that had already caused 2 seizures. He said Ethan's behavior was dangerous and potentially criminal. Carol accused Dad of being dramatic and choosing me over her son. The argument escalated until Carol said if Dad couldn't see that Ethan was just a confused kid trying to help, then maybe they'd made a mistake getting married. Dad told her that her refusal to hold Ethan accountable was the real problem. The fight ended with Carol taking Ethan and leaving to stay at her mother's house for a few days. 2 days later, I had my 3rd seizure. It happened at home while I was alone, watching TV in the living room. I woke up on the floor 3 hours later with a massive headache and realized I'd been unconscious for an extended period. My phone was across the room and I'd apparently thrown it during the convulsions. I called Dad at work and he came home immediately, finding me still disoriented and confused. He took me to the emergency room where Dr. Vincent examined me and ran more tests. This seizure had lasted longer than the previous 2, and Dr. Vincent was concerned about the increasing frequency and severity. He asked about my medication compliance, and I showed him the lab results proving Ethan had been replacing my pills with placebos. Dr. Vincent's expression turned cold and professional. He said he was documenting this as intentional medical sabotage and would be reporting it to both CPS and the police. He said what Ethan had done constituted assault under state law because he deliberately caused physical harm through medication interference. The police investigation was handled by Detective Ramirez, who specialized in domestic violence and child abuse cases. She came to the hospital and took my statement, reviewing all my documentation, the camera footage, the lab results, the photos of stolen pills and broken locks. She said the evidence was substantial and concerning, showing a pattern of escalating behavior that had resulted in serious medical consequences. She asked if I'd be willing to press charges, and I said yes, without hesitation. She explained that as a minor, the charges would be handled through juvenile court, but given Ethan's age and the severity of the offense, there was a possibility he could be charged as an adult. She took copies of everything and said she'd be obtaining a warrant to search Ethan's room for additional evidence of the fake pills and any documentation of his actions. The search warrant was executed 2 days later while Ethan and Carol were still at her mother's house. Detective Ramirez and 2 other officers searched Ethan's room and found a bottle of caffeine pills that matched the ones he'd used to replace my medication. They also found a journal where he'd been documenting what he called his experiments with my pills. The entries were chilling to read. He'd written about how funny it was watching me search for my medication each morning. He'd calculated how long it would take for missed doses to trigger a seizure. He'd noted the dates of my seizures with satisfaction, writing that his plan was working perfectly. One entry from a week before my third seizure read, "Need to replace more pills. Want to see if I can make him have one at school again." Everyone freaking out was hilarious. The journal made it clear this wasn't pranking. This was deliberate harm inflicted for his entertainment. Ethan was arrested at Carol's mother's house and charged with assault, reckless endangerment, and tampering with a pharmaceutical product. Because he was 16, the charges were initially filed in juvenile court, but the prosecutor filed a motion to transfer the case to adult court given the premeditation and documentation showing he understood the potential consequences of his actions. The hearing to determine jurisdiction was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Carol hired an expensive attorney named Philip Grayson, who immediately started building a defense based on Ethan's age and supposed mental health issues. Grayson argued that Ethan had been acting out due to undiagnosed anxiety and depression related to his parents' divorce and his mother's remarriage. He claimed Ethan didn't fully understand the medical implications of his actions and shouldn't be held to adult standards of criminal responsibility. Dad filed for emergency custody modification to keep Ethan away from me while the case was pending. The family court judge granted a temporary restraining order prohibiting Ethan from coming within 500 feet of me or our house. Carol was furious, calling Dad at all hours, screaming about how he was destroying her son's life over accidents and misunderstandings. Dad eventually blocked her number and communicated only through their attorneys. Carol filed for divorce 2 weeks after Ethan's arrest, claiming Dad had poisoned their marriage by refusing to support her child. The divorce proceedings moved quickly because they'd only been married 18 months and had a prenuptial agreement. Within a month, Carol had moved out completely, taking all her belongings and leaving Dad and me alone in a house that felt empty and quiet after so much chaos. The jurisdiction hearing was held on a Wednesday morning in a courthouse downtown. The judge reviewed all the evidence, the journal entries, the camera footage, the lab results, my medical records showing 3 seizures directly correlated to periods when Ethan had interfered with my medication. Grayson argued passionately that Ethan was a child who'd made terrible mistakes but deserved rehabilitation rather than punishment. The prosecutor, a woman named Lisa Thornton, argued that the level of planning and sustained deception showed criminal sophistication that warranted adult consequences. She pointed out that Ethan had multiple opportunities to stop and instead had escalated his behavior even after seeing me have seizures. The judge took 2 days to issue his ruling. He found that while Ethan was chronologically a juvenile, his actions demonstrated a level of premeditation and understanding that justified transfer to adult court. The case would proceed as an adult criminal prosecution. Ethan's trial was scheduled for 4 months out, and in the meantime, he remained in juvenile detention because Carol couldn't afford his bail. I had to testify at a preliminary hearing where Grayson tried to paint me as vindictive and exaggerating the danger of missed medication doses. He brought in an expert witness who testified that epilepsy was often manageable without medication and that occasional missed doses were common and rarely resulted in seizures. Dr. Vincent testified for the prosecution, explaining that my particular form of epilepsy required strict medication compliance and that the 3 seizures I'd experienced were directly caused by periods of inadequate medication levels in my system. He testified that the 3rd seizure, which had left me unconscious for 3 hours, could have resulted in brain damage or death if it had lasted longer. The judge found probable cause to proceed to trial and denied Grayson's motion to dismiss the charges. I started seeing a therapist named Vanessa to help process the trauma of being systematically poisoned by someone I'd lived with and trusted. She helped me understand that what Ethan had done wasn't about me personally, but about power and control. She explained that some people derive pleasure from causing harm and watching others suffer, especially when they believe they won't face consequences. Vanessa helped me work through the guilt I felt about the divorce and Ethan's arrest, reminding me that I hadn't caused any of this and that holding him accountable was necessary both for my safety and to prevent him from harming others in the future. The therapy sessions were difficult but essential because I'd started having nightmares about seizing and not waking up, about being trapped and helpless while Ethan stood over me laughing. The trial lasted a week. The prosecution presented the camera footage, the journal entries, the lab results, and testimony from Dr. Vincent about the medical danger Ethan had created. They called me to testify about finding my medication hidden and stolen, about the car break-in, about waking up on the floor after seizures not knowing what had happened. Grayson's cross-examination was brutal. He suggested I'd planted the camera specifically to entrap Ethan. He implied I'd written the journal entries myself and planted them in Ethan's room. He questioned whether I'd actually taken the fake pills or had simply kept the real medication and fabricated the lab results. The jury looked skeptical of his theories, especially when the prosecution presented handwriting analysis confirming the journal was written by Ethan and testimony from the lab technician who'd tested the pills confirming the chain of custody. The defense presented character witnesses who testified that Ethan was a good kid, who volunteered at church and helped elderly neighbors with yard work. Carol testified that her son was gentle and kind and would never deliberately hurt anyone, She claimed I'd always been jealous of her relationship with Ethan and had fabricated everything to break up her marriage. Grayson argued that Ethan's journal entries were creative fiction, a dark story he was writing for an online forum, not documentation of real actions. He said the camera footage had been edited to make innocent actions look suspicious. The prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. They brought in a digital forensics expert who confirmed the camera footage was unaltered and showed continuous timestamps. They presented evidence that Ethan had never submitted any creative writing to online forums and had no history of fiction writing. They showed that the dates in his journal entries corresponded exactly to dates when I'd found medication missing or had experienced seizures. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Ethan showed no emotion when the verdict was read, just stared straight ahead while Carol sobbed loudly in the gallery. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later and remanded Ethan to custody pending the hearing. Dad put his arm around my shoulders as we left the courtroom and told me he was proud of me for being strong enough to see this through. I felt relief mixed with exhaustion because the trial had been emotionally draining, having to relive everything and face Ethan across the courtroom while he glared at me like I was the villain in his story. The sentencing hearing brought impact statements from Dr. Vincent, who described the permanent anxiety I now experienced around medication and medical care. My basketball coach testified that I'd had to quit the team because physical exertion increased seizure risk, and I couldn't trust that my medication levels were stable. Vanessa submitted a written statement about the psychological trauma and ongoing therapy needs. I gave my own statement, describing what it felt like to wake up on the floor not knowing if I'd been unconscious for minutes or hours, not knowing if my brain had been damaged, living in constant fear of the next seizure. I explained that Ethan had stolen my sense of safety in my own home and my trust in family relationships. The judge listened carefully to everything before delivering his sentence. He sentenced Ethan to 3 years in juvenile detention, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. He ordered psychological evaluation and treatment, mandatory community service, and permanent prohibition from contact with me. He said Ethan's actions had demonstrated a callous disregard for human life and that rehabilitation would require intensive intervention. Carol screamed at the judge that he was destroying her son's future over teenage mistakes. Security had to escort her from the courtroom while she yelled that Dad and I had conspired to ruin her family. Grayson filed an immediate appeal, arguing that the sentence was excessive for a juvenile offender with no prior criminal history. The appeal was denied within a month, with the appellate court finding that the sentence was appropriate given the severity and duration of Ethan's conduct. Dad and I started rebuilding our life without Carol and Ethan. He attended therapy with me sometimes to work through his guilt about bringing Ethan into my life and not believing me sooner. He apologized repeatedly for dismissing my concerns and choosing to believe Ethan's lies instead of protecting me. I told him I understood that Carol had manipulated him and that Ethan was convincing in his performances. The forgiveness between us came gradually through honest conversations and his consistent support. I graduated high school 4 months after Ethan's sentencing and enrolled in college with a pre-med focus. The seizures had given me insight into neurology and patient advocacy that fueled my academic interests. I wanted to become a neurologist, like Dr. Vincent, someone who listened to patients and took their concerns seriously. I kept my medication in a locked safe in my dorm room and never told roommates where I stored it. The paranoia about someone tampering with my pills persisted, despite knowing Ethan was locked up. Vanessa said that hypervigilance was a normal trauma response and would fade with time and continued safety. Dr. Vincent adjusted my medication dosage after months of consistent levels, and the seizures remained controlled. He said I might eventually be able to reduce the medication if I remained seizure-free for several years, but that decision was far in the future. Ethan served his full 3 years in juvenile detention without parole because his behavior reports showed poor attitude and refusal to accept responsibility for his actions. His psychological evaluations revealed antisocial personality traits and a lack of empathy that concerned his treatment team. When he was released at 19, he moved out of state with Carol, and I never heard from him again. The restraining order remained in effect for the duration of his probation, and I hoped I'd never have to see him after that expired. Dad eventually started dating again and found someone named Helena, who was kind and genuine and never pressured me to accept her as family. She respected my boundaries and the trauma I'd experienced, and we built a relationship slowly over time based on mutual respect rather than forced proximity. 3 years after Ethan's sentencing, I received a letter from a lawyer representing a teenage girl who'd been dating Ethan. She'd found my name through court records and wanted to know if I'd be willing to speak with her client. The girl, whose name was Ashley, had experienced a similar pattern of medication tampering. Ethan had been hiding her asthma inhaler and birth control pills, claiming it was playful teasing. When she'd gotten sick from a severe asthma attack, she'd started suspecting deliberate interference. My testimony about his previous conviction helped her obtain a restraining order and press charges. The prosecutor in her case contacted me, and I provided all my documentation and testified about the patterns I'd seen in Ethan's behavior. He was convicted again, this time as an adult with adult penalties. He received 5 years in prison, followed by 10 years of probation. The judge noted that his previous conviction and lack of rehabilitation showed he posed an ongoing danger to others. I finished medical school and matched into a neurology residency program where I specialized in epilepsy treatment. My own experience gave me unique empathy for patients struggling with medication compliance and family dynamics affecting their care. I started a support group for people whose medical conditions had been exploited or sabotaged by family members, creating a space where survivors could share their stories without judgment. The group grew to over 50 regular participants, all with variations of the same nightmare. Relatives who'd tampered with insulin, hidden inhalers, stolen pain medication, or interfered with psychiatric drugs. The common thread was the difficulty of proving the abuse and the tendency of others to dismiss concerns as paranoia or family drama. We advocated for better documentation protocols and mandatory reporting requirements when medical professionals suspected medication interference. Dad and Helena got married when I was in my final year of residency, and I stood as best man at their small ceremony. He'd done years of therapy to understand how he'd failed to protect me and had become an advocate himself, speaking at family court proceedings about the dangers of dismissing children's abuse reports. He and Helena volunteered with organizations supporting victims of domestic abuse and medical neglect. Our relationship had healed through his genuine accountability and consistent support. He never asked me to forgive Carol or Ethan, never suggested I should move on or let go of anger. He understood that some betrayals leave permanent scars and that healing doesn't mean forgetting. I testified before the state legislature about the need for stronger penalties for medication tampering and better training for CPS workers to recognize medical sabotage as abuse. Several states passed laws specifically criminalizing interference with prescribed medications, creating felony charges for sustained patterns of tampering. Medical boards issued new guidelines requiring doctors to screen patients for medication access issues and document concerns about potential sabotage. Pharmacists received training on recognizing signs that prescriptions were being controlled or stolen by household members. The changes came too late to help me, but would protect future victims from experiencing what I'd endured. Ethan completed his second prison sentence and was released under strict probation conditions, including mandatory therapy and prohibition from contact with anyone under 25. He violated probation within 6 months by attempting to contact Ashley through social media. His probation was revoked, and he was sentenced to an additional 3 years. Some people never change, never develop empathy, never stop viewing others as objects to manipulate for their entertainment. I'd learned to accept that Ethan was one of those people, and that the best I could do was ensure he faced consequences and couldn't easily harm others. My safety and healing didn't depend on his redemption, only on my own boundaries and the systems that enforced them. 20 years after that first seizure on the kitchen floor, I ran a neurology clinic specializing in epilepsy treatment where patients knew they'd be believed and their concerns taken seriously. I never dismissed someone who said their medication was disappearing or that family members were interfering with their treatment. I documented everything, reported suspected abuse, and connected patients with resources to protect themselves. The work was emotionally demanding, but deeply meaningful, because I understood the terror of being medically vulnerable and deliberately harmed. Every patient I helped felt like justice delayed but finally delivered, turning my trauma into protection for others who faced similar dangers.